Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for part two of Help for Struggling Teens, hosted by Christian Family Solutions. We're so happy that you could join us. My name is Bree Grunwald. I am a community outreach representative at CFS and will also serve as your host today. A few housekeeping notes to share before we jump in. Your audio and video have been muted, so any questions or comments that you have, please just leave that in the Q&A feature below. This series will also be recorded, and you can find today's video underneath the resource tab on Christian Family Solutions website. And finally, please take a few minutes after the presentation to fill out a brief survey that will pop up on your screen. Now, today I am joined by Katelyn Bolte, Child and Adolescent Services Program Manager, and Emily Carlberg, Mental Health Practitioner and Parent Education and Adoption Resource Liaison. Katelyn holds her master's in counseling psychology and is a licensed professional counselor. She joined Christian Family Solutions in 2017. Katelyn meets with adolescents and adults for individual outpatient counseling and group facilitation. She also specializes in the delivery of CTSS services to children and adolescents. Katelyn is grateful to have the opportunity to integrate faith as desired by the client and evidence-based treatment at Christian Family Solutions. Katelyn strives to create a safe and supportive space for her clients to share their experiences and identify their strengths and create meaning in their lives. Emily Carlberg joined Christian Family Solutions in 2019 as a mental health practitioner, where she teaches parenting skill groups and in-home skills. For the past 6 years, Emily has been working with adoptive families at Legacy of Adoption Agency in Apple Valley, Minnesota. As an adoptive mother of 4 children herself, Emily understands the grief and loss associated with adoption and the complexities involved in adoptive parenting. Emily is passionate about helping adoptive and foster families find hope and healing in their own attachment journeys. Welcome, and thank you both for sharing your expertise with us today.
Thanks, Bree. Excited to be here today presenting with Emily. I'll start off with the webinar that we covered last week. So last week I presented a webinar on struggles that our teens are facing right now in America, essentially, and different mental health concerns that are presenting and different challenges that teens are having right now, especially related to the events of 2020. And so today we're going to talk a little bit more about how we can provide resources to parents who might be supporting teenagers through these difficulties. Last week we talked about different levels of care and supports for teens, and today our focus is going to be on how we can help support parents who then support teens. So if you're a parent listening, today is all about you. That's what we're doing today. We're going to go over an overview of difficulties that parents might be facing right now due to either struggles that they have with teenagers, increased difficulties that they've had in recent months, and then also specific strategies that you can use when you're parenting a teenager. Specifically, also supporting distance learning too. I know that's a hot topic that we hear about often, struggles with that. And so that's something that we'll address later in today's presentation as well. I'll just get started here talking about kind of a broad overview of difficulties that parents are facing right now. So first of all, we are seeing parents struggle with their own mental health concerns, partially due to some of the concerns that we talked about last week as well. And I'll get into a little bit more detail about that in our next slide. We're also going to talk about just typical developmental relationships that parents have with their teenagers. Some things are relatively normal, but that doesn't mean that they're any less difficult to navigate when it comes to teenage parent relationships. So we'll talk about that. And then we'll also talk about how trauma and different life events can impact a parent and teen relationship. And then finally, we'll talk about distance learning support, particularly as it relates to executive functioning and screen time, and different strategies that might be helpful to parents and families who are supporting teenagers with distance learning. So let's dive right in, talking about parent mental wellness. Last week's webinar, as I said before, reviewed several transitions that our teenagers are facing right now and how they're coping using the additional supports that we have in our communities, or how we can access additional supports for teenagers who are struggling. I will note that parents are also facing these difficulties too, right? So parents might have experienced a job loss this past year, a transition in their day-to-day routines, maybe a loss of financial revenue that they've had into the home due to a job loss. There's been changes in support systems. Perhaps you used to engage in a weekly Bible study or a book club, or even some of the activities that our children are involved in can be opportunities for us to connect and engage with other people who have children the same ages as we do. So there's been changes in that too. Just as our teens have had losses this past year, parents have also had losses this past year. And then finally, we've had a loss of normalcy and just, day-to-day transitions and changes too. Maybe you find out 2 hours before you were going to go into work today that you cannot go into work today because you'll be quarantining, or you have more children within the home because they're doing distance learning. And so some time that you used to have to yourself each week, you no longer have just because there's more people in home. And that's a transition for you too. And so we want to acknowledge that today and recognize that the events that have happened within the past year can also have an impact on parents as well, and just adults in general. Within our clinics, we have seen an increase in teenager referrals for counseling services, but also in adults as well. Individuals are struggling right now with transitions, and it's normal to see that given the circumstances that have happened within the past year. So an additional note on that, it can be really difficult for a parent to help a teenager and support a teenager, to help them remain regulated during difficult transitions when they themselves are struggling too. So when we have a teenager who's struggling with coping with their emotions, we want to step in and support that teenager. But when we're struggling with our emotions ourselves, then it can be extra difficult to help a teenager navigate those emotions. And so focusing on a parent themselves and staying regulated will long-term actually help a teenager remain regulated as well. And Emily's going to talk a little bit more about that in our next slide here.
Great. Hi, and I just want to say welcome again. Thank you for being here. And as a parent myself, who also has some kids at home doing distance learning this year, and everyone's navigating a new routine that showing up today says a lot about you as a parent, and that you're still willing to try something new. You're still willing to try figuring out how can we make this better for our kids. There are plenty of days when I've thrown up my hands and said, I don't want to try anything else. I'm tired and I want to give up. So kudos to you for being here. Thank you for being here. We appreciate it. So, and again, part of my job is I have the privilege of working with some of our children that are teenagers or in day treatment. But then a large part of my job is that I get to work with their parents and teach parent skills. And so what I want to I'll be touching today is topics that I've heard from our parents over the past year, just things that kind of keep sticking out as struggles that they're having at home. Here are just some tips for how do we keep our kids regulated. Dysregulated is kind of when we start getting hyped up, our kids are bouncing off the walls, having a hard time sitting still, having a hard time focusing, feeling anxious, or their fuse is maybe shorter than it used to be. And so here's some ways to kind of just keep things a little bit calmer around the house. One of the most important things, and we'll talk about this a little bit later too, but that providing structure so that your child's day is predictable as possible. Predictable is a word that is scary to say in 2020. Because we're in 2021, but over the past year, predictable has not been something that's easy to grasp. But if as much as you can, especially in your home, because you've been in your house a lot, if you can create a predictable environment for your kids, it will give them more predictability and a more sense of security as they're facing the unknowns that are outside of their house. This doesn't mean that every minute of the day needs to be scheduled, but as much structure as you can provide is helpful. So kind of knowing what's today going to look like. This is kind of what we do as a family in the morning. This is your expectation for the morning, or this is your expectation for when lunch will happen. This is when you need to get back on school. When this time happens, this is when it's free time. So again, not that you need to schedule every minute of their day. That's something that I know in America has been very common, thinking we need to have every minute scheduled, but this is more just providing structure. This may sound simple, but it is very important, especially for teenagers who are becoming more independent, making sure that they are staying hydrated and having regular snacks and regular meals. Being home and not having, this is your 20 minutes of lunchtime like they did back at school. It might be easy to not have a very routine times of eating or healthy eating, but making sure that they're first of all hydrated, and then also making sure that they're getting good snacks. Protein is a very important one, to be focusing not as much on the sugars and carbs and things like that. Also, just a note, hopefully you already know this by now, but I know that schools are offering free lunches if that's something your family wanted to tap into. Attend to sensory needs, even for teenagers. It is important that if they are having increased anxiety, which we're seeing in a lot of kids right now because life is unpredictable, which kind of creates anxiety, that we're attending to their sensory needs. So offering fidget spinners, stress balls. I know sometimes, and these were things that in the classroom was starting to really get figured out in the past couple of years, which was awesome, that teachers are recognizing our kids have these unique sensory needs, and so let's meet them so they can learn better. Unfortunately, as soon as we got that figured out in the classroom, then we tried to have one model of learning to work for all of our kids. So these are things you can do at home though, and have a little bit more freedom at home since it's just you in your house. But if you have a yoga ball to sit on instead of a chair, if you have, there's kind of balance things that you can work on, those stretch bands that they use in therapy that they can kind of be pulling on while they're listening to their teacher. This may sound counterintuitive, but I love chewing gum for our kids. Chewing gum actually can be a regulator as well as having something to suck on, suckers. And so I'm not pushing all the sugar, but I also am saying there are things that if they have something in their mouth while they're listening to their teacher, can also be helpful. So try to give them those tools to help kind of calm some of their anxiety and meet those sensory needs while they're trying to learn. Take movement breaks. This is also something I noticed back when my kids were in school. They were having a couple of recesses a day, and now all of a sudden they're just sitting in front of the computer all day long. Make sure that they are taking movement breaks. When they do get a break, encourage some fresh air, go outside and shoot some hoops, go on a walk around the neighborhood, take the dog for a walk, encourage movement breaks. Even if they're not feeling fidgety, because they've been in front of a TV or a screen all day, find unique ways for them to get their body moving when they do have a break from their screen. And the last one, I'm going to actually pass this one off to Katelyn. She's more of an expert on the deep breathing, but I'm using some of these calming techniques that we also get to use in the clinic.
Yes. And when I think about parents and teens kind of supporting one another right now, or parents supporting teenagers as they're struggling with transitions, and then parents are struggling themselves too, just a reminder to take deep breaths, to focus on moments in the present when you are doing those movements that Emily was just talking about outside, really taking in your environment, noticing the sunshine or how cold it is in Minnesota today, but just really being in the present and focusing on that can be really helpful to us in grounding ourselves and being able to regulate. And we can promote those things for our children and teenagers as well. So the behaviors that we are engaging in, whether that's practicing structure within our own days or eating nutritious meals ourselves as parents, then to modeling that for our teens and encouraging them to engage in those behaviors as well. So specific helpful times to engage in deep breathing and mindfulness could be before school, after school, if you're doing distance learning, or just kind of scheduled periods throughout the day. If you know that you typically have 5 minutes at the end of your lunch break before you kind of get back to your work day, that could be a really great time to just take a couple deep breaths and think about kind of where you're at emotionally today and what you need to do to get through the next couple hours. So we also have more resources too on our website, several really wonderful blogs there, and some new additional resources that will be added over the next couple weeks here too. So keep checking back if you're liking these tips for parents and teens and being able to regulate and manage your own mental health. Make sure to take a look at our website for additional resources. Next, I'm going to talk a little bit about the parent-teen relationship and some struggles that we can have within that relationship. So from a developmental perspective, teens do the following things as they're teenagers. It's just what teens do. And maybe you remember some of this from your own teenage years, but teens are going to have an increased interest in peer relationships. So that likely is going to reduce some time that you're seeing your teenager each day, because your teen's going to be interested in forming relationships with other individuals, which again, as we think about your teen, turning 17, 18, 19, potentially moving out of the house one day, those are all things that we want our teenagers to be able to do, to have a support system that is really wide and healthy. We also see teenagers struggling for independence. So again, our teenagers are supposed to be doing this, right? As they turn 16, 17, 18, 19 years old, we are preparing for adulthood and for life outside of our parents' home, and with maybe reduced access to parental support. So our teenagers can be healthy, well-functioning adults one day. And so as they do that, though, it can often result in conflict between parents and teens, which is really normal. And we see it happen often within relationships. It doesn't make it necessarily easier to navigate when I call it normal, but it is still something that we see frequently. And so when you see your teen striving for independence, we do want to work towards being able to compromise and negotiate and figure out what works for each individual family. And some of that can be done on your own, out in the community. And sometimes we have to bring in a counselor to help navigate that too. And there's no shame in that as we figure out what does it mean for my teen to be independent, but also in a healthy way, in a way that continues to support them and their own needs. And then finally, another factor to consider within teenage development is the maturing frontal lobe. And so with that, you've maybe heard this before, teenagers don't have fully developed brains. And so we know that there's a lot of development that's occurring in the brain in the teenage years. And oftentimes the wiring of a brain results in impulsivity from teenagers. We also see teenagers seeking out new experiences, which is really great when we're thinking about teens considering what happens in adulthood and like what I want to do with the rest of my life. And I'm taking in new information. And it can also result in some behaviors too that might look more like risky behaviors or YouTube is a constant stimulus. So as they're seeking out, frequent stimuli to take in new information, which is developmentally normal, sometimes we see that kind of veer off of healthy patterns too. And so that can make it difficult when you are parenting a teen and trying to provide structure to them to kind of have that balance of this is a normal developmental healthy thing, and then also balancing that with their structural needs that they do have. And then finally, teens can struggle to see the big picture. A lot of teens don't fully understand what's going on within their own brain as they're developing. They're seeking independence. They have these desires to have more connections with friends, and then their parents are still doing what parents do, right? Providing support to your teenagers and following through with what you need to do to support a teen. And that can result in conflict and strained relationships. And so Emily's going to talk a little bit too in the next slide about how attachment and different trauma experiences or stressors can impact a parent-teen relationship as well. And then in the next couple minutes here too, we'll talk about some different strategies that you can use to continue to have a healthy relationship with your teen despite some of these difficulties that you might experience.
All right. Yeah. So, and I want to apologize if we're using therapy lingo, or sometimes I talk about the same stuff at work all the time. So if we're using words that don't make sense, or executive functioning, frontal lobe, attachment, things like that, feel free to send your questions over and we can kind of go over those at the end. But so the majority of the kids that we work with here in the clinic have experienced trauma or abandonment at some point in their childhood. And so we see that they struggle with attachment in turn because of those things. But what we are recognizing now is that a global pandemic can probably be considered traumatic. So kids that were functioning very, very well and had very solid attachment to their parents, then this has kind of brought some uncertainty into their life. And when we were talking before about creating structure so that their lives could be as predictable as possible, that plays into attachment as well. So it is our responsibility as parents to create a safe and trusting environment for our children. And that's kind of what builds attachment with our children. When trauma comes in and disrupts kind of that feeling of safety, we need to work towards rebuilding that. And so we'll kind of go through some techniques that we can do, skills that we can be working on with our kids to help rebuild what sometimes can be shaken when traumatic things happen. So what we've also noticed though is distance learning has put a stressor on attachment. So for our kids back in March when distance learning started, a lot of our kids are already struggling with attachment issues, and all of a sudden these parents are being required to not only be the safe, trusting figure in their life, but they are also expected to be their teacher as well. And unfortunately, that sometimes clashes. It is being the parent and being the safe, trusted person in their life. When you correct your child, when there is an attachment issue, there is added shame to there, or added stress on there, where a teacher who can be someone that they relate very well to isn't the safe, trusted caregiver. And when they correct, there is a different feeling there. It doesn't disrupt their attachment when they have a correction. So we were seeing in our parents, and I'm assuming this is something that you're seeing at home as well, that when you are correcting your child, when you are telling them they need to do their homework, when you maybe have to correct their math or correct their problems or encourage them to stay focused on the screen, that it is adding extra stress to that attachment role. So some tips for how do we continue to promote positive attachment with our kids. I think right now there's a lot of, and maybe things have sorted out kind of over the year, and hopefully you've been able to find a good balance of how much do I push with school and how much do I let things just ride until we get to go back in person. And that's important for you to kind of work on at home and figure out what's the correct balance. And you know your teen better than we do, and we know, you know how much you can encourage and support and what their capabilities are. But if you come to a point of, okay, they're missing this assignment, or they're not showing up for this, or they didn't get this problem right, or things like that. If it comes to a point of, is this a moment where I connect with my child, or is this a moment where I should correct my child? We would always recommend that you connect with your child. And you can do that while still addressing school, but it might look more like, do your assignment. Instead of saying, do your assignment, you didn't do that right, it can say, what are you struggling with right now? How can I help you with school? Or if it's allowing them to have space to be done with the screen for a little bit, you can do that too, and spend time with you, play a game or go on a walk outside or something. We encourage you to choose connect. If you do have to correct, that is definitely a part of being a parent. We in no way are advocating that you don't have to correct things. But if you do have to correct, we encourage you to sandwich it with connection on both ends. And connection can be a positive statement. It can be an encouragement. It can be playful. It can be a joke. It can be making soft, non-intimidating eye contact. Eye contact is great for connection, but sometimes can be intimidating. So that's not the connection we're looking for after correction. If your child is open to physical touch, and we know teenagers are all over the board on that, and want to stay away from parents or not, but if you can offer physical touch or a pat on the back or hand on the shoulder, that's wonderful. If you can do that too, those are little bits of connection that you can do around a correction. When you do have to correct something about school, or you do have to ask them to do another assignment or something like that, make sure that they know that the message is, my relationship with you means more to me than your achievement in school. It's not that you're worried about their bad grades because you want them to have a really good grade, but that you want them to meet their potential, and that you understand where they're struggling and you want them to achieve their best. So letting them know that your relationship with them is most important through all of this. Something that we found at home, and I know not everybody has this, but if you do, I would strongly recommend that you utilize it if you can. But again, going back to that idea of when trauma happens, it can shake up the attachment with trusted caregivers. If there's someone that you can get involved that has a good relationship with your child, that can be that person to help make corrections on homework, engage those people. I know that there are grandparents sitting at home that are quite lonely, and if they can engage, again, your kid might not be open to more Zoom time, but if you're able to get someone else involved to help make those corrections, so it doesn't have to be you as a caregiver, that's great. We've seen a lot of positives coming from that in our house, and with some of the parents that we work with as well. And hopefully you realize this by now, because we're a long ways in, but one message that we had to communicate a lot when we were seeing our parents really struggling at the beginning was, if you are struggling with distance learning, if you're teenager struggling with distance learning, this is not a reflection on your parenting, and it is not a reflection on your child's intelligence. My first reaction was, I have a lot of good friends that can homeschool and they make it sound so wonderful and romantic, and their kids are doing great. Why can't I do this? And why can't my kids do it? And for a lot of the reasons that we just listed, there's a lot of reasons why this is not working for our kids. Our school systems had just kind of gotten to a point where they recognized our kids' unique needs in learning. And as soon as they got there, then we had to strip all that away and just do one mode of learning for our kids and hope that everybody succeeded. Kind of talking back about the development of the frontal lobe. So maybe we'll just jump to the next, yeah. And again, if these are kind of big words, feel free to ask questions, or if it doesn't really make sense. When we talk about executive functioning, that's similar to what Katelyn was saying about the frontal lobe. So this is kind of like the front part of the brain. When we are working with our teens here, I call it the upstairs brain, especially for our kids who have experienced disruption in attachment and trauma or abandonment. When we're describing, I'll try to describe how I describe it to the kids, but there's a downstairs brain, which is more of the reactive part of our brain, kind of the survival part of our brain. And then there's the upstairs brain. And this is kind of our forward thinking brain. This is our executive functioning part of the brain. When kids have experienced trauma, their brains can overdevelop in the lower reactive part of the brain and not giving as much space and time and energy to develop the upstairs brain. And like Katelyn was saying, for teenagers, it's not fully developed even if they haven't experienced trauma. However, unfortunately, distance learning requires a lot of upstairs brain, a lot of executive functioning skills that are not fully developed in our kids, and might not be fully developed until they're in their 20s. So when, again, kind of going back to this idea that it does not reflect on your child's intelligence if they're really struggling in distance learning. It might just be that the model of distance learning is a very hard way for their brain to learn. Distance learning requires a lot of following kind of extensive directions. It requires not a lot of one-on-one time. And these are all things that can be a big struggle for our kids who are struggling with executive functioning. So some ways that I hopefully these are things you maybe tried a little bit already, but I want to encourage you on if you haven't already. So I know that our teachers are overwhelmed, but I also encourage you to be an advocate for your kids. And because they aren't in the classroom with their teachers now, that as a parent, we do need to be our advocate, the advocate for our teenager, being able to communicate where you're seeing them struggle at home. In regards to executive functioning, it is hard if we're struggling with executive functioning, it's hard to follow long directions. So if you're able to help their teacher, or if you're able to help them break down their assignments into as clear and concise of directions, and as just a couple directions at a time. If you're able to do, here's step 1 and 2, come back to me when you've completed those, and then we'll work on 3 and 4. When they're kind of sending out a bunch of assignments and kind of sending out long lists of steps, it can be overwhelming and confusing for our kids. So if you can break down steps, that's a huge help. Having it all on the screen can also be overwhelming. If there's any ways that you can get things on paper, try to do that. And even kind of going back to the one step at a time, if you can highlight little pieces of information to kind of stand out and make things clearer for them. If you're able to get more one-on-one support, I know we've seen a lot of families that it wasn't until distance learning that they realized, okay, maybe I need to apply, or maybe I need to talk about getting an IEP and getting more help because I'm seeing a lot of struggles at home. And that's okay to ask for more help and ask for those supports. A wonderful thing that our school did last year that I loved and I've encouraged parents to use with their teachers and their schools. Again, it's kind of about paring it down right now and having clear, concise directions and clear, concise expectations. If you could break down the workload to it, what must I get done? What should I get done? And what can I do maybe for extra credit, or if I'm feeling challenged, or, I think everyone's kind of trying to figure out how do we manage time and what is a good allotment. What might take one kid 15 minutes at home might take 2 hours for another kid. So breaking it down into what's the absolute minimum. Not that if you're seeing your child excel, then of course continue to take on assignments. But if they're struggling to succeed, what is the minimum that we can get done? Because in that, and again, I think parents are feeling concerned, like I don't want them to fall behind. If we just do the minimum amount of work, I don't want them, to be way behind when we get back in person, or what if they don't get the material covered that they would have gotten if they were in person. Instead of the content and the amount of content being the priority, I encourage you to see the priority as what can make my child feel confident in school. So many of the kids, they've gotten on the computer and they just don't get it, and it's overwhelming, and they feel like, you know what, it's safest for me to just not try. If I don't try, then I can't fail. And that is leading a lot of our kids to really be falling behind in school. If we can get to a point where they feel confident about doing their schoolwork, and that might mean having a smaller workload, that we want to encourage them to do that. If they can start building up their confidence again, to get back on that computer, talk with your teacher, I feel good about school, then that's when we can start raising our expectations of getting more work done. But if they're struggling to show up and they're feeling overwhelmed, let's figure out what's the minimum amount of work so that I can feel confident about what I'm turning in. Screen time. I don't know if anyone else feels uncomfortable just reading that. So many feelings about screen time. That was probably one of our biggest problems before COVID hit in parent coaching and parent skills. And now all of a sudden the kids are sent home with more screens, and they're required to be in front of them all day long. So how do we handle it? I'm very excited that we have the technology that we do. I mean, I don't know how we would have gotten through a school year without being able to do distance learning, but it does definitely provide unique and extra challenges that our parents are facing. It's been interesting. It's one thing when we had, parents have devices that they purchased for their kids. They are in control of the data limits on there. They are controlling, they paid for them, so they get to kind of have a say in them. Then all of a sudden a school device comes home, and there's a different feeling of ownership for our teenagers, and a different things that our parents need to navigate about how do we set limits on this device that kids kind of think, well, this is mine. This is from my school gave it to me. This is something that we see even more so in our kids that have experienced trauma or attachment issues, that they're more likely or more able to easily attach to an actual device or an object. So there's a whole slew of other issues that go with that as well. But just for the average teen, the electronics have kind of added some new struggles. So a couple of tips that we have about navigating and having another screen at home. Again, I know schools are feeling overwhelmed, and you might feel like they're already hearing enough from people or whatever they, I think a lot of times we trust we should trust our schools, but we assume that they know what they're doing. And so if they send a device home, then I should let my kid do whatever they say with their device. But make sure that you are communicating with your school. If you do have concerns about device usage, make sure that you're communicating those. If you have parameters for your kids at home of, I want our devices turned off at this time, or I don't want them having X amount of screen time, or things like that, be in communication with your school about those. You can still voice those with your school. Every school device is different in different districts and different schools, and kind of what safety parameters they have put on their devices. It is your school's responsibility to make sure that there are safety parameters put on their devices. But that doesn't mean to not keep an eye on your kids while they're using them. Technology moves really fast. Our kids are really smart, and there's still easy ways for kids to access things that maybe the school wasn't able to catch. So still be diligent about checking to make sure what sites they're visiting. If you do have concerns and you're not able to see kind of a history of where they've been on their computer, reach out to your school. They should be able to provide you with kind of a snapshot of where your kid has visited on websites or things like that. I would encourage parents to use their devices for school only. It's very easy to use it for other things because they can get on the internet. Have school devices just be school devices, have them only on when school is on or working on a homework assignment, and then put them away. So it's not an added screen temptation. Do Do not let your kids have their devices in their rooms at night. Again, this just kind of goes to safety in regards to kind of what they can access. And there should be safety parameters on your kid's device that prevent them from going on scary sites. But there's a whole slew of kind of staying regulated and mental health that has to do with screens and sleep. So keep those screens out of the room at night. And if possible, I know you want to provide a quiet space for your kid to work. But I would encourage you, if there's a quiet place that you can also keep tabs on, kind of just keeping an eye on them every once in a while and kind of where they're visiting. It's easy to get distracted on other websites while they're supposed to be Zooming, and easy to kind of get pulled into other sites. So if you can have them in a public place in your house, it's encouraged if you can also provide quiet for them to work on their stuff.
Thank you, Emily, for those tips. I've had a couple questions too about what does it look like for teens to transition back to face-to-face schooling from distance learning. So as we're addressing all of these concerns related to distance learning and how parents can continue to support teens, kind of on the other hand too, we do have some schools that are transitioning back to in-person services, and there's transitions and anxiety that can occur too when we're considering those transitions. So the first thing is to just normalize that any transition is difficult for anybody. It's tough to transition, right? And it's pretty normal for anxiety to come up when we're going through a transition, or some worry because there is unknowns within transitions. So some different factors to consider when you do have a teenager that's potentially transitioning back into in-person school is, first of all, how does your teen do with transitions typically? Are they able to quarantine last minute notice without having that totally uproot their schedule? Or will they be okay taking a couple days off of school should they need to due to a quarantine? Or is it better for them to have something where they can have that consistent structure? And maybe that is distance learning this year, if that's an option for your school, or something with a hybrid model where you have consistency in schedule. Another thing to look at is what supports your teen has in person that they might not have at home. We really talk about wrapping up our teens and the most services and supports that they can have possible. And so if there is different access to teachers or different classrooms at school that they might benefit from, that they just don't have access to at home, we do want to consider that and potentially consider the risks or difficulties in transitioning back to school, should it mean that they have additional supports that they have access to. And then finally, too, we want to consider the impact of distance learning or returning back to school on the parent-child relationship. So has it been overall a positive experience to have your kiddos home with you, or is it causing strain on your relationship as you are kind of playing that dual role of the person who's ensuring that math homework is done and then also the person who is, being the parent and connecting and enjoying that parent-child relationship. So that's something to consider as well. And again, if there are additional supports that are needed, regardless of the decisions that your family is making for virtual school or face-to-face school, consider reaching out to Christian Family Solutions or other mental health professionals in your community to kind of walk through those transitions. We have a lot of great resources on our website, presented a webinar last week that should be posted on there as well too, that you can kind of take a look at different supports that we have for teenagers and their families. That's all I have today on our topics in supporting parents, but we do have, it looks like, some questions floating in. So Bri, I'll let you read those off.
That's wonderful. Thank you, Katelyn and Emily. This was a lot of really great information that you guys provided us today. I did see that there were some people who commented in our Q&A feature that they had difficulties with their audio throughout the presentation. And so just so you guys are aware, we are recording this series. I will be sending out a follow-up email with today's recording. And then we're also, like Katelyn had mentioned, posting them on our resource tab. So if you're having any difficulties with that today, feel free to check those out and jump to the parts that it may have been difficult for you to hear on, and hopefully it will be better for you there. So I apologize for any audio concerns on that end. But with the questions, you guys, we will jump right on in. Let's see here. We have a handful that we can go through. And you kind of covered some of them were in regards to transitioning back and forth between virtual and in-person school. And so I think you guys did a great job covering that aspect. Somebody is wondering, how should I as a parent be involved in my child's therapy? Should I be talking about their therapy sessions at home with them? What does that typically look like, and what do you guys recommend?
Yes, I can touch a little bit on that as the therapist. So when we're talking about teenagers, we want to really honor that therapeutic relationship that a teen has with their therapist. So they feel safe and comfortable coming to talk to their therapist and knowing that not all of those details are going to be shared with their parent. At the same time, when a teenager lives inside a parent's home, it's important that the parent overall knows what's going on and knowing how they can support their teen and help them regulate. So that's going to look different with each therapist provider, kind of the ins and outs of that relationship. My general thing that I tell to teenagers is I'm going to tell your parents kind of like the big things going on, right? Like we're struggling with anxiety related to school, and we've been struggling with some self-esteem related concerns right now. And I'm not going to tell parents all the details about the friendship drama that you're having, and this person said this to this person, and all those details that we talk about within session, unless there's a concern with risk of harm to self or harm to other people, or a teen is talking about doing really risky behaviors, in which case we're always going to make sure that teen is wrapped in. But overall, we try to, to honor that parent relationship with a teenager. We're going to make sure that we cover kind of the big hitters. This is what the teen's struggling with, and this is how you can support them. And then not go into all those details that teens want to keep private if possible.
Very helpful. Thank you, Katelyn. Another question, and this one might be geared more towards Emily, but correct me if I'm wrong. The question is, what is parent coaching?
I don't like the name at all. And I'm trying to, think through what is, it's a better name, because a lot of our parents have gone through a lot more parenting. I do have 4 kids, and they definitely keep me busy and on my toes. And, we've experienced different issues related to attachment and trauma there too. But a lot of our parents have already gone through a lot of stuff. And so to kind of feel like I'm their coach doesn't feel like the right term, but it is a service that is offered through CTSS, which is Child Therapeutic Supports and Services. And what we do in parent coaching is we will talk about kind of what are some of the struggles that they're seeing at home, what are some of the behaviors that they're dealing with, how do we understand their behaviors through a lens of what the need might be behind that behavior, if it is attachment and trauma based and mental health related, and how do we respond to those behaviors through that lens to kind of meet the need that is driving the behavior. So those are kind of the we sometimes call it parent skills as well. That's kind of what we work on during that time.
Awesome. Thank you. That's very helpful, Emily. Another question, and I know that this is unique to a number of different places, but specifically to CFS, with us being a Christian organization, someone was curious about if the client does desire to incorporate their faith into their treatment, how do we do that at CFS? What does that typically look like?
Yes. So when a client desires to have integration of faith with their evidence-based practice, which is just a fancy word for the strategies that research has shown us work well to help cope with anxiety and depression, we're going to look at different ways that we can integrate that within your experience. So whether that's talking about prayer, or we're going through Bible passages, or we're thinking about like, what facts do we know that God says about us to be true, even though we feel this way, right? We know that sometimes facts and feelings, and this is a very therapy thing that we do, that our facts and feelings don't always align, right? So we might feel something, but we know that it's not true. So it's really neat as a Christian therapist, when I have a client who desires to integrate that, to be able to incorporate that for our families, and to be able to say, like, this is what we know is true from the Bible. And we can honor the way that we feel right now, and kind of hold both of those things, but ultimately rely on God's word and the strength that we have from that as a source of support.
Thank you. That's very helpful to understand how that works specifically at CFS. So I appreciate that, Katelyn. One of the last questions that I have here, and I think it's a really good one to just have in the back of your mind as a parent, should you ever have to cross this bridge, is, if my teen is in a crisis, what do I do? Where do I turn?
Yes. So obviously, if it's a medical emergency or a mental health emergency, we are going to encourage you to call 911 as well. A lot of local areas, I guess locally here in Mankato, we have a crisis line too that's local to our county. And I know Dakota County, which is up where Lakeville Clinic is located, too, has a crisis line that you can reach out to and have mental health supports come out to your home to provide support within those moments as well. So I would really encourage you to kind of dig in and see what crisis supports exist in your county. But ultimately, if it is an emergency, calling 911 within a crisis experience, that's what those professionals are for. They're there to support you within moments of crisis, whether that's a medical emergency or, you know, a risk of harm within the community. In a mental health emergency, they are there to support you as well, and they're not going to be shameful about you reaching out for supports if needed.
Thank you. And you know what, you guys, we had a couple of other questions, but we have already come to our 12:45 marker. So I will wrap up our conversation for today. And thank you again, Katelyn and Emily. This has been just some really, really great information for our parents to know, and to our attendees. Thank you so much for joining us for this educational series. If you have any additional questions or you're interested in learning more about our services that are offered, please feel free to reach out to our team. We would be more than happy to answer those for you guys. And until next time, we look forward to being together, and take care. Thanks again.
Thank you.